Hey classmates, Justin Bergen here. I apologize for the tardiness of this post. It should have been done last week. I was a little caught up with my flight training at the school and neglected online. I realize that affects you guys because this class is so small. So I figured I'd talk about, since GPS is one of my, I don't want to say struggles, but one of the things I can improve on. I wanted to talk about non-precision approaches, specifically GPS approaches. So we know we've got the precision approaches, such as your ILS, and then we've got our non-precision approaches, which is pretty much everything else. And it's important to realize that an ILS is absolutely a great tool because that can get us down to like 200 feet AGL, so we can break out of the clouds, we can have less visibility, and it's a lot easier to get down. However, it is an expensive unit to maintain, so only the bigger airports are going to have it. So if you're flying out of a littler airport, odds are you're not going to have an ILS, you're going to be a non-precision approach. And so that can be whether it's just a localizer, so maybe the glide slope's in-op, or maybe they just don't have a glide slope installed, so it's the localizer, or that can be all of your RNAV, your GPS approaches. So the first, I'm out of North Las Vegas, and so I printed off an approach chart here, and so we've got the localizer ILS, and we can see here that for the, I'm reading it backwards, but for the ILS, 267 feet, whereas the localizer is 431 feet. And so we can kind of see a big difference there. They both require mile visibility, but we can see the big difference into the altitude that we can fly down to. So, whereas on our RNAV, or our GPS rather, we're going in for straight into 2620, so 415 feet. So that's about this, a little better actually than what the localizer is. 431 feet for the localizer, 415 for the GPS approach. So with GPS approaches, there's a few different types, and this is what initially is kind of not been confusing. This can get confusing for students. We've got the LP, LPV, so localizer precision or localizer precision with vertical guidance. And then we also have LNAV, VNAV, so that's lateral navigation with vertical navigation, or just LNAV, which is just lateral navigation. And so we can kind of think of that in our mind similar to a localizer for the LPV, because it's localizer performance, so it's acting just like a localizer. Now the big differences with this is the modes. So the GPS has multiple modes for the CDI sensitivity as to the course width that we're flying. So as we're flying along, and this is kind of tough for me to do without a blackboard behind me, but as we're flying along, we can imagine our course width en route is going to be about 2 nautical miles. So we're flying, and on each side of us we have 2 nautical miles, and that's our course width for our sensitivity on the CDI needle. And that's on our en route, and that's going to be up to 30 miles, well, further than 30 miles from our final approach fix. So once we get to within 30 miles of our final approach fix, it goes from en route to terminal mode, and that goes all the way down from 30 miles from the final approach fix to within 2 miles of the final approach fix. And that 2 nautical mile course width shrinks down to 1 nautical mile on each side. And so while we're getting into this more precise area where we're trying to get in closer to the runway, basically that's just making our CDI needle a lot more sensitive so we know where we're at. And that way our deviations aren't as drastic. And then when we're on the approach mode, so we've got the en route, the terminal, and then finally is the approach mode, makes sense. And that's that's with the 2 nautical miles to the final approach fix, and that's 0.3 nautical miles, so 0.3 of a nautical mile left and right. And it's important to realize that on our LNAV, VNAV, and LNAV approaches, from the final approach fix all the way into the threshold, it's going to continue at that 0.3 nautical mile course width. Whereas with our localizer performance and the localizer performance with vertical guidance, our LP, LPV, it works similar to a localizer, but it's the GPS that's going to basically angle in the the course width sensitivity. So instead of having that 0.3 nautical miles from the final approach fix all the way into the threshold, it's going to act like the localizer, and it's going to taper all the way down from the final approach fix at 0.3 nautical miles on each side, all the way down to 350 feet on each side, which, with our with our ILS or localizer, we know that at the threshold it's approximately 700 feet wide, so 350 feet on each side. That's something that the GPS is capable of creating for us, which is pretty awesome. And then, of course, for non-WAS GPS, the en route is 5 nautical miles, just to jump back to that real quick. But, so it's important to realize a difference with the LNAV and LNAV plus V. So a lot of times we'll see that plus V, and we need to understand that that is not acceptable by the FAA as vertical guidance. It is just advisory, so it's for situational awareness. It's the GPS creating a vertical path that you can follow down to make a smooth transition to all of your step downs. And so that's kind of a profile that your GPS has created for you. And so if you're doing LNAV plus V, it's important to realize that you're at the LNAV minimums. You do not get to jump up to the LNAV VNAV minimums, which may be slightly different. So let's see, with that, those are the main things on that. And it's important to note that when we do go missed approach, especially on like an LPV approach, when you hit that go around button or that suspend button, it's going to jump back up to 0.3 nautical mile width. So your CDI needle, rather than being on like your LPV, where it comes all the way down to that 700 or 350 left and right at the threshold, it's going to go back to that 0.3, 3/10 of a mile, nautical mile sensitivity course width. Let's see here. Let me make sure I've covered everything I want to cover with that. So, of course, we still have our circling approach minima. So, I mean, if we're going to be going straight into, in this case, 1-2 right, then we know that that's, 2620. Whereas if we're going to be circling any other runway, then we've got 2680. So that's not going to be a big difference there. Now, here at this airport, we don't have, we just have the straight end with the GPS approach. A lot of times you'll also see on different approach plates where it'll actually specify a difference between LNAV or LNAV, VNAV, or LPV or LP approaches. So that'll be, that can be different on different approach plates. I just have my check ride Sunday, so I only printed out the approach plates I'll be using. So, I know we talk about the instructional knowledge and common errors and all that related to non-precision approaches. So a common error with that could be seen definitely as that plus V, because on our G1000 we're lucky enough to have in the HSI there, it's going to tell us what our mode is. So are we en route, are we terminal, or are we in the approach mode? So it's going to tell us that, so we know what our GPS sensitivity or CDI sensitivity is. And then it's also going to tell us what our minima is. So it'll say right there LNAV, VNAV, or LNAV plus V, or LPV. It'll tell us that in the little magenta and within the HSI. And that tells us as the pilot what we're going to be able to select as our minima on the approach. So the GPS is automatically going to pick the best or lowest minima approach that's available to the GPS. So if we have full WAS capability, which in our aircraft we do, or my aircraft I do, I'm the 172 G1000, we have WAS, so it'll automatically pick the best approach. Now if for some reason it doesn't have WAS, or maybe something's out, or it just doesn't have the full satellite coverage, because we need 6 for WAS, so maybe if one's not in sight and we only have 5, but we still have RAM, so we can do our approach, but we don't have the WAS, so we might not be able to do that LPV. So it will downgrade to the LNAV VNAV, which is the next best, and if that's not available, then it will downgrade to LNAV. And so it's important to see that and realize as the pilot that it's up to us to input the minima associated with that approach. And if we were to downgrade during an approach, I mean, we can still continue the approach. It's just important that we level off at that next highest minima that the aircraft is flying. Meaning, if we go from LPV down to LNAV, VNAV. So, yeah, that should be about it. And yeah, so I hope everyone has a great week. And well, last week, hope they had a great week. Hope you have a great week this week. We'll talk soon. Good luck, everyone.